A single German memo reached Allied hands in the final months of World War II, filled with secret routes, hidden codes, and whispers of Hitler's escape. It looked real, too real. But was it truth, or the most dangerous lie ever crafted in the war's shadows? November 1944, London. The war had entered its final, most desperate phase. Across Europe, Allied armies were tightening the noose around the collapsing German Reich. But inside the Allied intelligence headquarters, another kind of battle raged. One fought not with tanks or rifles, but with information. It began with a single sheet of paper. An intercepted German transmission, decoded, stamped, and filed among thousands of others, landed on the desk of intelligence analyst Maurice Klein. He had seen hundreds of such messages. Most contained logistical chatter, troop reports, or coded directives that told predictable stories of retreat and desperation. But this one felt different. Its heading read Southern Sanctuary Protocol, and it mentioned Argentina repeatedly. At first glance, it looked authentic. The language was precise, the formatting exact. The typeface matched official Reich documents. The seals and paper texture bore no sign of forgery. Everything appeared correct. Too correct. Klein had been in intelligence long enough to recognize a strange truth. Real documents often contained small flaws. Typos, smudged stamps, rushed signatures. This one felt unnaturally polished, as though crafted by someone who wanted it to be discovered. He leaned closer, tracing the lines with a pencil. The memo spoke of established, escape corridors to the Southern Hemisphere, of designated safe houses in Buenos Aires, and of secured financial transfers through Swiss intermediaries. Even more alarming, it included coordinates that allegedly marked submarine routes crossing the Atlantic. If genuine, this could mean something extraordinary. The Nazi leadership was preparing to flee. Klein's pulse quickened. He checked the encryption header. It bore a pattern rarely seen before. The cipher sequence wasn't random. It repeated in a deliberate rhythm, almost as if someone wanted the Allies to notice. He carried the paper upstairs to Colonel Raymond Polk, his superior. Polk was a stern man, more soldier than scholar. He read in silence, eyes narrowing. Then slowly he looked up. "This could change everything," he said. Within hours, the memo was circulating among Allied intelligence branches. Some saw it as the long-awaited breakthrough, proof that Hitler might escape and that the war could drag on from another continent. Others dismissed it as propaganda, but few dared ignore it. For Klein, doubt and duty collided. He knew what was expected. Forward the intelligence, help confirm its credibility, and let higher command decide. Yet something inside him resisted. His instincts told him this document was wrong, crafted not by mistake, but by design. He spent that night alone in his office, comparing the memo with dozens of verified German documents. The ink density, the alignment of margins, even the rhythm of phrasing, all slightly off. It wasn't enough to disprove authenticity, but it was enough to unsettle him. Outside, London slept under blackout curtains, unaware of the silent war happening inside locked intelligence rooms. By morning, the memo had gained traction. Reports spread across Allied networks, South American banks under observation, shipping manifests under review, reconnaissance flights being redirected toward Atlantic routes. Every decision drew attention away from Europe. Klein watched the chain reaction unfold. If the memo was real, this was vital work. If it wasn't, they were chasing a ghost. He looked again at the paper, his pencil tapping nervously. Southern Sanctuary Protocol. Why use such a name? Why reveal so much detail if secrecy was essential? Every word seemed carefully chosen to provoke Allied fears. Hitler escaping, Nazi networks rebuilding abroad. A war that might never end. Klein felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold London air. He wrote a private note in his logbook. Document authenticity uncertain. Patterns suggest possible deception. It was a small act of defiance, a whisper of skepticism in a room full of certainty. But the machine of intelligence moved too fast for doubt. orders were issued. Resources shifted. The rumor of an Argentine connection began echoing through Allied channels. Even newspapers whispered of Nazi escape plots, feeding speculation and paranoia. Klein remained uneasy. He knew one truth above all. In war, deception is as dangerous as any weapon. And the more perfect the lie, the easier it is to believe. He tried to focus on his routine assignments, but the memo haunted him. During lunch breaks, he found himself rereading it. Every phrase sounded like it had been written for him. To be found, to be believed, to be acted upon. Late one evening, he looked again at the encryption header. The repeated pattern, 3 symbols, 2 pauses, felt almost intentional, like a hidden signal. But what did it mean? For days, he told no one. Doubting official intelligence was dangerous. If he was wrong, he'd jeopardize his career. If he was right, the Allies were wasting precious time chasing a phantom. The weight of that possibility pressed down on him. By the end of the week, the memo had been validated by multiple Allied analysts. The consensus was clear. It appeared authentic. Plans were drafted for deeper investigation. Klein signed the clearance forms mechanically, though every fiber of his being resisted. He told himself that maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe, for once, the truth really was as it appeared. But something inside him whispered otherwise. He didn't yet know that thousands of miles away, in a dim office beneath the Reich Chancellery, another man was smiling, watching the trap begin to close. The invisible war had just begun. And Morris Klein, without realizing it, had already stepped into the center of one of the most sophisticated psychological operations of the entire conflict. The city was breaking apart. Bombs fell in the distance almost daily. But beneath the Reich Chancellery, in a narrow room lit by a single hanging bulb, Major Anton Richter was building something invisible, something meant not to destroy, but to confuse. He was an officer of intelligence, not infantry. His battlefield was the human mind. Years earlier, he had studied linguistics, propaganda, and the psychology of persuasion. Now those skills had become his only weapons. His orders were clear. Create confusion. Delay the enemy. Protect the Führer's movements at any cost. But Richter already knew the truth. No one dared say aloud. The Reich was collapsing. The war was lost. Still, he worked. Not from loyalty, though he maintained the discipline of an officer, but from purpose. He believed in precision, in the art of deception as strategy. Even in defeat, the mind could remain sharp. And sharp minds could still wound. For weeks, Richter studied the patterns of Allied intelligence. He had captured decoded transmissions, reports of intercepted communications, lists of names and methods. He began to see the rhythm of Allied fear, what they looked for, what they believed, what they wanted to find. A thought formed quietly. What if he could give them exactly that? He understood how Allied analysts worked. They trusted patterns, confirmation, replication. They believed repeated information must be true. So he would build something that seemed to come from multiple sources. Something that would confirm itself. That was how the Southern Sanctuary Protocol was born. The idea was daring, almost absurd, convince the Allies that Hitler had escape plans for South America. Argentina was perfect, far from Europe, sympathetic leadership, known to harbor German interests. The deception would play into existing Allied anxieties. If they believed Hitler might flee, they would shift focus, divert aircraft, spread their efforts thin. Richter designed every detail with mathematical precision. He began by selecting real elements, genuine submarine codes, authentic South Atlantic coordinates, legitimate bank transfers made years earlier through Swiss intermediaries. He blended truth and fiction until the boundary between them vanished. To make it credible, he used genuine Reich stationery, obtained from damaged administrative offices. He forged official signatures, carefully imitating pressure points from known examples. He borrowed the handwriting of authentic officers down to the angle of each letter. He even aged the paper itself, soaking it briefly in tea, drying it near sunlight and folding it in ways that mimicked natural use. The edges looked worn, but not deliberately so. A perfect illusion of authenticity. The language was deliberate, too. He avoided melodrama. Instead, he used restrained phrasing, the tone of bureaucratic precision. Transfer of designated personnel to secure zones. Submarine allocation for special convoy. Funds safeguarded under neutral oversight. Each line sounded routine, official, almost dull. That was its genius. Real intelligence rarely looked dramatic. It looked tedious, and Richter understood that tedium could be the perfect disguise. But in the middle of the document, he added one flaw, a minor inconsistency that only a meticulous analyst might notice, a date that didn't align perfectly with recorded events. He inserted it intentionally, a signature of sorts. If the Allies discovered it, they would know the document was false. If not, the deception would run its course. He called this flaw the silent key. Every deception, he believed, must contain a small truth, or a small mistake. Without one, it becomes unbelievable. As he wrote, distant explosions shook the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling, but Richter did not flinch. The sound of destruction had become background noise. His assistant, a young clerk named Werner Vogel, occasionally entered with files or ink refills. Vogel didn't know the full purpose of the project. He thought he was helping prepare evacuation documents. Richter allowed the misunderstanding. The less Vogel knew, the safer he was. Late at night, Richter often worked alone. Cigarette smoke curled upward as he reread the pages by dim light. He thought about the Allied officers who would one day hold this paper, men in well-lit rooms in London or Washington, their brows furrowed as they debated its meaning. He imagined their urgency, their sudden reallocation of resources, the shift in their focus. He wasn't trying to win the war anymore. He was trying to delay defeat. Every day bought through confusion meant something. A few more trains could leave Berlin. A few more families could flee. Perhaps, he thought, even his own. But sometimes, when the corridors fell silent, doubt crept in. What if this deception changed nothing? What if the war's machinery had already consumed everything? Truth, lies, victory, and defeat alike. He shook off the thought and returned to work. When the final draft was complete, Richter reviewed it one last time. The seal impressions looked perfect. The ink color matched authentic Reich issue. Even the typewriter, a salvaged Olympia model, produced slightly uneven spacing identical to that of official machines. He smiled faintly. The craftsmanship mattered. In deception, presentation was everything. He placed the document in a coded packet marked for field transmission. Then, with deliberate care, he routed multiple copies through separate channels. One through intercepted radio traffic, one through captured couriers in France, another through fabricated Swiss intermediaries. The trick was simple. If the same intelligence appeared in different forms from different sources, the Allies would assume it was verified. Richter understood Allied psychology as well as his own. The most effective lies are those that exploit belief, not contradict it. Before sending it off, he stood for a moment, hands resting on the desk. The room was quiet except for the distant thud of artillery. The air smelled faintly of ink and smoke. He thought of the war's absurdity. Millions fighting, dying, while men like him fought invisible battles over words and paper. He felt no triumph, only completion. He sealed the envelope, marking it with the appropriate clearance level, and handed it to Vogel. "Deliver this to communications. No copies left behind." Vogel nodded and left. Richter sat back, staring at the blank space on his desk where the document had been. A hollow feeling settled in his chest. He had just released something into the world that would move across borders, through minds, across oceans, something invisible yet powerful enough to alter the course of events. He wondered who would find it first. Would they believe it instantly, or would someone, some distant counterpart, sense the deception beneath the surface? Richter allowed himself a thin smile. If such a person existed, they would understand him, not as an enemy, but as an equal. Outside, the city trembled again under the weight of bombs. Inside, Major Anton Richter had created a weapon that made no sound at all. The war had entered its cruel winter. Snow covered Europe's broken cities, but the real frost crept through the corridors of Allied intelligence offices. Whispered rumors, shifting priorities, unseen traps. The Southern Sanctuary Protocol had begun its silent journey. Somewhere in northern France, an OSS field unit recovered a bundle of captured German documents from an abandoned communications post. Among them, one peculiar file stamped with the Reich Eagle and marked Confidential Southern Transfer Operations. It was a duplicate of Richter's creation, routed perfectly as he had planned. When Agent Laura Pennington brought it to her superiors, it was treated as a major find. The coordinates matched submarine paths. The phrasing hinted at secret evacuation plans. To Pennington, a skilled analyst who'd spent months hunting Nazi escape rumors, it looked like confirmation of every suspicion she'd held. Across the channel, British MI6 received a similar document, allegedly smuggled by a defector in Switzerland. And, almost simultaneously, Soviet intelligence intercepted coded transmissions referencing Operation Southern Sanctuary. 3 separate sources, 3 different paths, 1 identical story. That was Richter's brilliance. His fabrication didn't rely on one lie. It relied on repetition. Each version validated the others. Every new discovery became proof that the intelligence was real. Within a week, Allied command was mobilizing analysts, aircraft, and resources toward the South Atlantic. Surveillance flights were redirected to monitor South American ports. Naval intelligence reviewed shipping patterns to Argentina and Chile. Every confirmation felt like progress. Every report strengthened the illusion. And yet, in London, Maurice Klein couldn't shake his doubt. The more others believed, the more he hesitated. He had seen forgeries before, but never one this perfect, never one that aligned so neatly with the fears of command. His instincts told him something dangerous was happening, something carefully designed. He filed a quiet request to re-examine the document. The response came swiftly from Colonel Polk. Request denied. Focus on forward operations. They needed action, not theory. But Klein couldn't stop thinking about the document. Late at night, when the offices emptied, he returned to his desk and reopened the files. He began comparing the Southern Sanctuary memo against known authentic German records, 1 line at a time. The first anomaly appeared small, the spacing between words. The memo used a typewriter model that produced slightly tighter letter intervals than most German intelligence machines. He noted it, then found another. Tiny imperfections in the Reich Eagle stamp, the ink shade just a tone lighter than standard issue. Individually, meaningless. Together, unsettling. Klein's eyes ached from the effort. Hours passed, but he pressed on. He compared the phrasing of standard Reich directives, short, commanding, efficient, to the fluid, almost cautious language of the Sanctuary Protocol. It read more like something meant to convince than to command. It was persuasive writing, not military writing. He recorded every observation carefully, knowing that, without proof, they were only impressions. But impressions were often where truth began. Meanwhile, across Europe, Richter's plan was unfolding exactly as intended. Reports flowed back to Berlin confirming that Allied aircraft were now surveilling the Atlantic. Intercepted intelligence showed renewed interest in South America. The Allies were chasing shadows. Inside his underground office, Richter allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. He knew the deception wouldn't last forever. But for now, the illusion was alive and growing stronger with every passing day. Back in London, Klein began feeling the weight of his solitude. Colleagues whispered that he was becoming obsessed. Even his wife noticed his unease, the sleepless nights, the way he lingered too long at the office. He didn't care. Something about the document refused to let him go. It wasn't just the details, it was the intent. Someone had built this with purpose, not haste. Someone had wanted the Allies to see it, and that thought chilled him more than any battlefield report could. By Christmas Eve, Allied High Command considered the Argentine theory credible enough to alter strategic focus. Klein watched helplessly as resources were diverted, reconnaissance priorities shifted, and reports began emphasizing the potential South American refuge. Each decision made the deception stronger. Klein reread the memo once more, searching for anything, any flaw that could break the illusion. Then he found it. A reference to a meeting in Berlin dated October 14, 1944, supposedly attended by 3 officers. But Klein knew one of those names, an officer killed during the September bombings. It was small, but undeniable. He sat back, heart pounding. It wasn't just instinct anymore. There was evidence. A ghost inside the document. A mistake so subtle that only someone desperate enough to look would ever find it. Klein realized what this meant. If this was deliberate, then somewhere on the other side of the war, an intelligence officer was playing his own game, one that used Allied fear as the bait. The thought terrified him. He wrote another report, detailing the inconsistencies but stopped before sending it. What if he was wrong? What if his doubts caused command to dismiss a genuine threat? The responsibility was suffocating. In that moment, he understood the true burden of intelligence work. It wasn't knowing what was real. It was knowing that you could never be completely sure. So he waited, quietly documenting, quietly doubting, while the world around him believed a lie. And far away, in Berlin, Major Anton Richter listened to intercepted Allied chatter and smiled faintly. His deception had crossed oceans. It had entered the minds of his enemies. The trap was holding. But somewhere, one man was beginning to pull at the threads. January 1945, London had grown quiet in its exhaustion. Air raid sirens still wailed some nights, but the city no longer flinched. The war was nearing its end, yet inside the stone corridors of Allied intelligence, one man found no peace. Morris Klein sat at his desk. The Argentine memo spread before him like a wound that refused to close. He had read it hundreds of times. He could recite its phrases from memory. Yet each reading deepened his unease. The details were flawless, but not natural. Crafted, staged, deliberate. His colleagues had moved on. The memo had become accepted intelligence. It was referenced in strategic briefings, cited in reports, even used to justify new naval reconnaissance routes. Klein's name appeared on one of the first validation notes. He had done his job. On paper, the case was closed, but his mind wouldn't rest. He began losing sleep, spending his nights poring over typewritten pages, comparing fonts, ink types, and phrasing. He pulled old files from archives, searching for connections. His office filled with charts, notes, and photographs. The janitor once asked if he was redecorating. Klein just smiled faintly and said nothing. His instincts told him something crucial, something dangerous, was hidden in plain sight. He remembered his training. The most convincing lie always carries a trace of truth. Whoever had written this document understood that principle. The level of craftsmanship suggested not a random hoax, but an operation, planned, executed, and meant to be found. The question was why. Klein started cross-checking references in the memo. The first lead was a submarine designation, U-977. It was real. Records confirmed it. But the coordinates listed in the memo didn't match its last reported position. A discrepancy of hundreds of miles. Too far for a simple clerical mistake. Then, another anomaly. The memo mentioned a meeting in October 1944 at the Berlin Transportation Ministry. But Allied bombing reports showed the building had been destroyed weeks earlier. Either the writer didn't know that, or didn't care if the reader noticed. Each inconsistency was small, but together they formed a pattern, a whisper that said, "Look closer." Klein documented everything in a private notebook. He knew sharing these doubts too soon could end his career. In intelligence work, being wrong wasn't just embarrassing. It could be seen as disloyalty. Yet, the alternative, staying silent, felt worse. When exhaustion finally forced him home, his wife noticed the change. He hardly spoke, barely ate, his thoughts always elsewhere. She asked if the war was getting to him. He said it wasn't the war, it was the truth. She didn't understand, and he didn't expect her to. The next morning, Klein took his findings to Colonel Raymond Polk. Polk listened patiently at first, scanning Klein's notes. The colonel was pragmatic, a man of results, not theories. When Klein reached the part about mismatched coordinates, Polk frowned. "So you think this entire operation is a fabrication?" he asked. Klein nodded. "Yes, sir. A calculated deception, designed for us to find." Polk leaned back. "You're saying the Germans are feeding us false intelligence deliberately?" Klein hesitated. "Not the Germans, sir. Someone very specific. Someone intelligent enough to construct a lie this convincing." The colonel said nothing for a moment. Then he sighed. "Morris, even if you're right, the damage is already done. Command is acting on this data, and the war is moving fast. We can't afford second-guessing right now." Klein left the room with no reassurance. He understood Polk's position, but that didn't make it right. So he went back to work, alone. Each new day brought deeper obsession. His colleagues began avoiding him. They whispered that he had become paranoid. But to Klein, the clues were multiplying. He started tracking how and where the memo appeared. Different copies surfacing in different regions, each slightly altered, but identical in essence. That could only mean one thing: distribution through multiple controlled channels. A deception built to appear self-verifying. Klein saw a pattern in the chaos. The forger had wanted the Allies to believe they had discovered the truth independently. It was brilliant, almost admirable. Across the ruins of Berlin, Major Anton Richter sat in his office, following the progress of his creation through intercepted Allied transmissions. He noted how the Americans, British, and Soviets had each received copies. The operation was unfolding exactly as designed. But then a report caught his attention. An encrypted Allied dispatch referencing inconsistencies in the Argentine document. Someone had noticed. Someone was digging. Richter felt a strange flicker of curiosity. A single analyst, perhaps, questioning what others accepted. He didn't feel anger or fear. Instead, he felt something rare: respect. There, in an enemy's mind, lived a reflection of his own. Back in London, Klein began to feel that same invisible connection. He didn't know who had written the memo, but he sensed intelligence behind it, a mind operating with precision, perhaps even admiration for his own. The thought disturbed him, yet drove him forward. By mid-January, Klein had compiled a report thick with data: photographs, ink analyses, signature comparisons, timeline charts. The evidence was strong but circumstantial. He needed more. Proof that couldn't be ignored. The days grew longer. His hands trembled from lack of sleep, and his superiors grew impatient. Yet he pressed on. Each new inconsistency felt like a step closer to an unseen adversary. He imagined that person, perhaps sitting in a dark office in Berlin, surrounded by maps and papers, constructing lies with surgical precision. Whoever they weren't doing this for glory. This was craft. This was method. This was war without guns. By February's first week, Klein was nearly consumed. His health deteriorated, his temper frayed, but his purpose sharpened. He no longer worked to impress command. He worked to prove the truth. He didn't realize it yet, but across the channel, events were aligning that would soon give him exactly what he needed. In France, a captured German officer was about to speak, and with his words, the invisible war between two minds, one in London, one in Berlin, would finally begin to surface. For now, Klein sat alone in his office, surrounded by the echo of typewriter keys and the faint hum of city silence. Outside, Europe was burning toward its end. Inside, a single analyst fought his own battle, one of reason against deception, truth against illusion. It wasn't fought with weapons, it was fought with doubt. And doubt, when wielded by the right mind, could be the sharpest weapon of all. February 1945. The war was reaching its breaking point. Berlin burned nightly. And yet, the most crucial battle was happening far from the front lines. Inside interrogation rooms, beneath low ceilings, between men too exhausted to lie. At a remote Allied facility near Paris, intelligence officers were questioning captured German personnel. Most offered routine information, supply routes, radio frequencies, fading loyalties. But then, one prisoner said something different, something that would change everything. His name was Werner Vogel, a communications specialist from Berlin. He was thin, pale, and tired, his eyes dull from weeks of captivity. To the interrogators, he seemed harmless, even defeated. They asked about German radio systems, but his answers drifted toward something else. He spoke of practice documents, typed under supervision, for something called psychological operations. At first, his interrogator, Captain Andrew Walsh, barely noted it. Every army had its propaganda units. But Vogel mentioned something else, an operation designed to mislead Allied intelligence, using forged directives and coded transmissions. He remembered typing phrases about Argentina. Walsh froze. He didn't understand the significance, but he recognized the name. Argentina. It matched the strange memo that had caused weeks of confusion in London. The captain sent an urgent report to Allied intelligence headquarters. When the message reached Maurice Klein, he felt a jolt of recognition. Within hours, Klein was on a transport to France. He arrived at dawn. The interrogation facility was cold and bare, its windows frosted over. Vogel sat in a wooden chair, his wrists loosely chained, his voice calm but weary. Klein studied him quietly before the questioning began. Vogel didn't look like a hardened spy. He looked like a man who had seen too much and understood too little. The conversation was careful, almost clinical. Klein showed Vogel a copy of the Southern Sanctuary Protocol, without revealing its importance. Vogel stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said softly. "That looks familiar." Klein leaned forward. "You've seen this before?" Vogel hesitated, his eyes distant. "Not exactly this one, but I typed similar drafts, under supervision, for psychological operations." Klein's pulse quickened. "Who supervised?" Vogel swallowed hard. "A major from intelligence." Name was Richter. The room fell silent. Klein's mind raced. He had never heard the name, yet something about it sounded inevitable, like a missing piece finally sliding into place. Vogel continued, explaining how he and others in Berlin had been ordered to create documents meant to deceive. The goal was to make the Allies believe in false escape routes, secret bases, and coded financial networks. Vogel described how the papers were treated, aged, and marked to appear authentic. Tea for staining, sunlight for wear, signatures copied from destroyed files. Every detail matched Klein's earlier suspicions. The deception was no accident. It was engineered. Then came the final revelation. Vogel spoke of one deliberate flaw, a small inconsistency included on purpose, so that if the deception lasted too long, someone clever might one day find it. Klein felt his chest tighten. He remembered the flawed date in the memo, the meeting that couldn't have happened. That was it. That was the flaw. He realized then that he had not only uncovered a forgery, he had stepped into a duel of intellect with a man he'd never met. Major Anton Richter had planted a ghost in the document, a silent test of his opponent's mind. And Klein had passed it. When Vogel finished speaking, the room felt strangely still. Klein sat motionless, the weight of confirmation pressing down on him. The memo was a fabrication. The greatest deception of the war's final months had been exposed. But victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt hollow, heavy. The damage had already been done. For months, Allied command had diverted resources to South American surveillance. Countless hours, ships, and aircraft had been misdirected, all because of one man's imagination and another's conviction. Klein thanked Vogel quietly. The prisoner simply nodded. His cooperation wasn't an act of betrayal. It was surrender, not to the Allies, but to exhaustion. Vogel said he no longer cared who won. "We all lost something," he murmured. "Even those who think they're winning." Klein didn't respond. He understood too well. That night, he stayed in the dim quarters provided by the base, unable to sleep. He thought about Richter, the faceless architect behind the lie. He pictured him working late into the night in a ruined city, writing each word with precision. What drove a man like that? Was it belief? Or simply duty? The war blurred those lines. When Klein returned to London days later, he carried Vogel's testimony and every supporting document he could gather. The next step was clear: convince Allied command. But even truth had to fight for attention amid the chaos of war. Colonel Polk met him in the briefing room. Klein laid everything out: photographs, transcripts, comparative analyses, and the prisoner's signed statement. Polk read in silence. His face gave nothing away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "If this is true," he said, "we've been chasing a ghost." Klein nodded. "Yes, sir. A ghost built from paper and fear." For the first time in months, Klein felt something close to relief. Not joy, relief. The kind that comes from finally proving what your instincts had whispered all along. But even as the truth settled in, he couldn't shake a thought. Richter's deception had nearly succeeded. The memo had fooled some of the best minds in Allied intelligence. It wasn't just clever. It was art, dangerous art. And somewhere beneath the ruins of Berlin, the artist might still be alive. March 1945. The war's end was now visible on every map. Allied armies pressed deep into Germany from the west. The Soviets thundered in from the east. Yet inside a high-security conference room in London, the greatest battle being fought was not on any battlefield. It was for the truth. Morris Klein stood before a table crowded with men who held the fate of nations in their hands. British, American, and Soviet intelligence officers filled the room. Stacks of papers, decoded messages, and captured files lay spread out before them. The topic was singular: the Southern Sanctuary Protocol. Klein spoke first, his tone calm but firm. He presented his findings with methodical precision: charts, photographic comparisons, and the testimony of Werner Vogel. Each point built upon the last, a structure of evidence that no emotion could distort. He explained the inconsistencies, the false coordinates, the mismatched ink, the impossible meeting date, the recycled submarine codes. Then he revealed the testimony, the proof that the document was born not of panic or accident, but of deliberate design. As he spoke, faces around the table hardened. No one interrupted. Even the Soviet delegate, Colonel Dmitry Sokolov, known for his impatience, sat motionless. When Klein finished, silence filled the room. The implications were devastating. For months, Allied command had redirected resources based on a forgery. Reconnaissance flights had been dispatched across the Atlantic. Intelligence agents had been stationed in South America. Naval units had altered their patrol routes, all chasing a phantom. Finally, Sokolov broke the silence. "You are saying," he said slowly, "that our enemy made us deceive ourselves?" Klein nodded. "Yes, they didn't need to send false orders to our agents. They only needed to give us what we already feared." It was a perfect description of psychological warfare, a weapon made not of steel or gunpowder, but of expectation. The British officers exchanged uneasy glances. The Americans looked grim. None wanted to admit how thoroughly the deception had worked. Colonel Polk spoke next. "We cannot change the past," he said quietly, "but we can correct our course now." That was the moment the illusion died. Orders were issued that afternoon. Terminate all operations connected to the Argentine memo. Cancel surveillance over South American ports. Reassign resources to their original objectives: the final assault on Germany and the capture of its leadership before they could truly disappear. It was the fastest redirection of intelligence focus in months. Radios buzzed, files shifted, and the machinery of war adjusted itself to new priorities. For Klein, it felt like exhaling after months underwater. Yet victory felt complicated. He had proven the deception, but in doing so he had revealed how vulnerable they all were. Not to weapons, but to belief. Later that evening, he walked alone through the quiet corridors of headquarters. The sound of distant typewriters echoed faintly, like mechanical heartbeats. He thought about Anton Richter, the unseen architect of the lie. The man had managed to shape Allied action without firing a shot. Klein couldn't help but feel an uneasy respect for him. In another world, perhaps they might have worked side by side, deciphering rather than deceiving. But in war, brilliance served whoever could wield it. Across the continent, the consequences of Klein's revelation rippled outward. Allied strategy refocused on Berlin. Intelligence analysts turned their attention back to the heart of the Reich. Resources once wasted on phantom chases were now directed toward identifying the last Nazi command centers. In early April, the first signs of real collapse began to appear. Radio traffic from Berlin grew frantic. Supply lines failed. German communications fragmented. Inside the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, Major Anton Richter received word that the Allied intelligence redirection had begun. His deception was over. He read the intercepted messages in silence. There was no anger, no surprise, only a faint, weary satisfaction. The operation had achieved what it was designed to do: buy time. Whether that time mattered in the larger picture, Richter couldn't know. But in the logic of intelligence work, every delay was a small victory. Still, he couldn't help wondering who had discovered him. Somewhere among his enemies was a mind that had seen through the smoke. That thought lingered longer than any sense of failure. He continued to monitor Allied communications as long as he could. Through coded reports, he learned the name Klein, the man who had unmasked his creation. He smiled faintly when he read it. He noticed the flaw. Richter murmured to himself. Good. For a brief moment, he felt something rare, a sense of connection with his adversary. In the end, both had done exactly what they were trained to do. Both had fought the same invisible war, from opposite sides of the same shadow. By mid-March, Berlin was collapsing. Richter's unit received evacuation orders, but he remained behind, finishing the destruction of files, ensuring nothing useful fell into enemy hands. Meanwhile, Klein's world began to move faster. The Allied machine, once tangled in illusion, was now sharper than ever. Reports came daily of advances, captured towns, crumbling German defenses. Each message carried the same rhythm. Berlin first. End this war before it escapes again. Klein's report on the Southern Sanctuary deception was officially classified as resolved. His role was acknowledged privately, but not publicly. The war was too vast for one man's discovery to earn attention. Still, his colleagues treated him differently now. The same men who had once dismissed his doubts now nodded with quiet respect. He didn't celebrate. He just worked. Because the truth, he realized, had a cost. For every deception exposed, dozens more went unnoticed. The war wasn't just fought with soldiers and planes. It was fought with ideas, lies, and the minds that believed them. As the weeks passed, Klein's thoughts returned often to the man he'd never met. Richter had used intelligence like a weapon, but even weapons have consequences. The irony was clear. In his attempt to mislead the Allies, Richter had ended up teaching them how to see through deception. That, Klein thought, might be the real legacy of the Southern Sanctuary Protocol. By the end of March, Allied command had one focus: Berlin. The deception's shadow faded as real battles drew near. But in a way, its echoes never stopped. It had revealed the fragility of perception, the danger of certainty, and the immense power of a single false idea. Somewhere in Berlin, Richter likely understood that too. April 1945, Berlin was collapsing into silence and smoke. The grand capital that once symbolized power now echoed with distant explosions and the hum of advancing enemy lines. Inside a narrow office buried beneath the Reich Chancellery, Major Anton Richter sat among half-packed files, listening to the muffled thunder outside. He already knew. The deception was over. Through intercepted fragments of Allied communication, he had confirmed what he suspected weeks earlier. The Southern Sanctuary Protocol had been exposed. The Allies had stopped searching the Atlantic. Their eyes were back on Berlin. The ghost he had created was gone. Richter closed his final report, staring at the stack of empty folders on his desk. Around him, typewriters had fallen silent. His clerks had been reassigned or vanished. Even Werner Vogel, his quiet assistant, had disappeared weeks ago. It was strange, he thought, how a war could shrink to a single room, to one man sitting in the ruins of his own creation. He wasn't bitter. He had done his duty. He had followed orders not to win, but to confuse, to delay, to make the enemy hesitate. And for a time it had worked. But wars, Richter knew, did not belong to tacticians or deceivers. They belonged to time itself. And time had finally run out. He lit a cigarette with trembling hands, the flame flickering against the cracked concrete walls. A faint draft carried the distant echo of artillery. Somewhere above, the chancellery ceiling was caving in. He imagined the Allied forces advancing across Germany, methodical, relentless. He pictured the men who had uncovered his deception. He wondered what kind of person had seen through it. Probably someone quiet, someone patient, someone who noticed the small things others ignored, someone like himself. A strange peace settled over him. In his final act of defiance, Richter burned what remained of his records. Every note, every forged seal, every coded draft. He wasn't hiding his failure. He was erasing his footprint. In intelligence, disappearing was sometimes the only victory left. As he fed the papers into the metal bin, he thought of the irony. His greatest creation, an illusion designed to mislead, was now part of history, invisible and untraceable. The Allies would never know how close they had come to believing it entirely, or how one analyst's persistence had saved them from continuing the chase. He smiled faintly. "Well done, whoever you are," he whispered to the smoke. Outside, the world was ending. But Richter felt strangely complete. He had built something out of nothing, and it had lived long enough to matter. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, in the quiet offices of Allied intelligence in London, Morris Klein was studying the final reports from the front. Berlin was surrounded. The war's end was a matter of weeks, perhaps days. Hitler had not escaped. The Argentine safe houses, the submarine routes, the hidden accounts, none of it was real. The Southern Sanctuary had been a ghost, and that ghost had finally been exorcised. But Klein found no satisfaction in victory. He sat alone at his desk, reading the latest intercepted communications. They were fragments of desperation, orders contradicting orders, voices breaking under pressure. He had spent months fighting an invisible enemy. Now that enemy was collapsing, and all he felt was exhaustion. He looked at the last page of his report, where he had written a single line. The deception achieved its goal for approximately 4 months. 4 months. It didn't sound like much, but in war, 4 months meant lives, missions, momentum. He couldn't help wondering, what might have changed if those months had been spent elsewhere? If the resources wasted on phantom leads had been directed toward real targets? That thought would stay with him long after the war ended. In early April, the news began arriving in fragments. The Soviets were inside Berlin. The German government was splintering. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. Every new report brought the same message. This was the end. Yet Klein couldn't shake the image of the man who had written the memo. Major Anton Richter. The name haunted him. The documents from Vogel's testimony described him as a methodical officer, calm, intelligent, and devoted to precision. Klein pictured him as a mirror, an enemy version of himself. The thought left him unsettled. He wondered if Richter knew his deception had been discovered. If he understood that his silent war had been lost, not by bombs or soldiers, but by details. The kind of details Klein had spent his life studying. As the days passed, Klein followed every intelligence update from Berlin. He tracked the Soviet advance street by street, block by block. By late April, the final reports arrived. Bunker activity detected. Radio silence from German high command. Fires spreading through the city. The war's last chapter was being written in smoke and rubble. On April's final night, Richter sat in his office for the last time. The air smelled of ash and paper. He thought of the deception he had crafted, and the man who had unraveled it. He no longer saw them as enemies, but as two sides of the same intelligence war, both bound by duty, both prisoners of the systems they served. He closed his eyes and listened. The rumble of artillery grew closer, shaking dust from the ceiling. Somewhere, the city's heart was being torn apart. He wondered if his name would survive. Probably not. Men like him were not remembered. Their victories and failures were buried under larger stories. The front lines, the generals, the treaties. But somewhere, perhaps in London, a man named Klein might remember. And that, Richter thought, was enough. When dawn rose over Berlin, it revealed nothing but ruins. The German capital was finished, and deep beneath its shattered streets, one of the most brilliant deceivers of the war vanished into history without a trace. In London, Klein received the final confirmation. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was gone. The war in Europe was over. He sat quietly for a long time. The office around him buzzed with celebration, laughter, relief. But Klein couldn't join in. Victory had come, but it wasn't clean. It had been earned through loss, confusion, and doubt. He thought about the deception again, how easily it had spread, how deeply it had taken hold. He realized that the war had not only been fought across continents, but across the human mind. As he packed up his files, he paused for a moment and wrote one last note in his logbook. Deception ends where truth refuses to surrender. He closed the book gently. The battle between him and Richter was over, but its echo would live on, in the lessons learned, in the vigilance it demanded, in the quiet knowledge that wars of the mind never truly end. That day, as celebrations erupted across London, Morris Klein stepped outside into the cold morning air. He didn't cheer or smile. He simply looked east, toward a city that no longer existed, and thought of the man who had fought him without ever knowing his name. May 1945, the guns had finally fallen silent. After 6 years of war, Europe stood still, shattered, exhausted, and uncertain of what victory really meant. For Morris Klein, the silence felt heavier than the noise ever had. The endless days of decoding, verifying, and chasing phantoms were over. The world had moved from crisis to reckoning. But the work of understanding what had truly happened, the invisible war fought in shadows, was only beginning. Berlin had surrendered. Hitler was gone. The Reich was finished. And the Southern Sanctuary Protocol, the deception that had once sent Allied intelligence into a frenzy, was officially exposed. It had never been real. No escape routes, no Argentine strongholds, no submarines ferrying leaders to safety. The document that nearly changed the course of Allied strategy was, in truth, nothing more than ink and intent. Klein's final report was submitted to Allied command within days of Germany's surrender. It was detailed, clinical, and written without pride. It outlined how the deception had begun, how it spread, and how it was finally uncovered. The conclusion was clear. The Argentine Memo was one of the most sophisticated psychological operations of the war. 4 months of misdirection, 4 months of diverted flights, reallocated agents, and wasted resources. In the grand scale of the conflict, it might have seemed minor, but in the world of intelligence, it was significant. A single false document had managed to redirect the momentum of 3 Allied powers. Klein received commendation for his analytical work. His superiors praised his persistence, his attention to detail, his refusal to accept convenient truths. Colonel Polk shook his hand and told him, "You saved us from chasing ghosts." Klein nodded politely, but he didn't feel like a hero. He couldn't stop thinking about those 4 months. Every hour spent searching for phantom submarines was an hour lost somewhere else. Perhaps a convoy could have been protected, a bridge captured sooner, a life spared. The thought gnawed at him. The deception hadn't cost battles, but it had cost time. And in war, time was measured in lives. When the official analysis was completed, the Southern Sanctuary Protocol was sealed under high classification. Very few would ever know it existed. Fewer still would know the names of the men who shaped it, one who built the lie and one who broke it. Klein returned home for the first time in years. His wife met him at the door, older, quieter, but still patient. He barely spoke for the first few days. Sleep came fitfully. The war might have ended, but its echoes hadn't faded. Some nights, he dreamed of typewriters, keys clacking endlessly, forming words that could change history. Other nights, he dreamed of a city burning, and a man in uniform feeding papers into a fire. He didn't know why those images haunted him, but they did. He later learned, through post-war intelligence briefings, what became of Major Anton Richter. The German officer who had masterminded the deception never made it out of Berlin. His name appeared briefly in captured files, listed as missing, presumed dead, during the city's final assault. There was no body, no photograph, no closure, just a line in a report. Status: confirmed deceased. Klein read the note twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside his personal file. There was nothing to celebrate. The man had been his adversary, but not his enemy. In quiet moments, Klein found himself wondering what Richter had been thinking during those final days. Did he know his deception had failed? Did he care? Or did he take comfort in knowing that, for a brief time, his illusion had worked exactly as designed? In his mind, Klein didn't picture a villain. He pictured a mirror. Two men on opposite sides fighting the same kind of war. By summer, reconstruction began. Europe tried to rebuild itself from ashes. But within intelligence circles, the lessons from the Southern Sanctuary Protocol became a quiet obsession. Analysts began reviewing verification procedures. They introduced new systems for cross-checking documents, for independent analysis, for questioning intelligence that seemed too perfect. The deception had changed how the Allies thought. It had exposed a weakness, not in equipment, but in perception. Years later, Klein would hear senior officers refer to that period as the ghost season, when Allied intelligence had chased illusions built by the enemy. Few knew the full story. Fewer still knew that one man's doubt had ended it. To the world, the war was over. To Klein, it was merely transformed. The lies were quieter now, but they still existed, in propaganda, in politics, in memory. When Colonel Polk retired later that year, he left Klein a handwritten note. In this work, you never get certainty, only conviction. You had it when others didn't. Klein kept the note in his desk drawer. He never framed it. He understood that history rarely remembered men like him. The public celebrated victories won by soldiers, not by analysts in dim rooms. But that was fine. The unseen victories mattered just as much. Because sometimes, he thought, the greatest service a person could perform in war wasn't in what they destroyed, but in what they prevented. As Europe began to heal, Klein finally stepped away from military service. He carried with him not pride, but perspective. The war had shown him how fragile truth could be, and how easily deception could shape reality. And somewhere in those ruins of the past, he left behind a legacy that few would ever recognize: the invisible triumph of a man who saw through a lie before it became history. 1946, Washington, D.C., the war was over. But in the corridors of intelligence, a new kind of war was already taking shape. One fought with whispers instead of weapons, and with secrets instead of armies. Morris Klein stood before a packed room inside the War Department building. The men listening to him were not soldiers but strategists, intelligence officers, and analysts, the kind who would shape the next generation of American intelligence. The United States had entered a new era. The world was dividing again, not by borders, but by ideologies. And in this new conflict, deception would remain as powerful as ever. Klein was there to brief them on what had become known only within classified circles as the Argentine Memo case. He spoke without theatrics. His tone was measured, his language simple. He told the story of a single document, how it had crossed borders, deceived nations, and diverted resources, how it had almost altered the timeline of victory, and how one deliberate lie had weaponized the truth itself. He described Major Anton Richter, though he had never met him. He called him the architect of precision, a man who understood that the greatest deception didn't look false. It looked exactly like what the enemy wanted to believe. The power of psychological warfare, Klein said, is not in making people believe lies. It's in making them believe what they already fear. The room was silent. Many of those listening had served in Europe. Some had worked in intelligence units that unknowingly acted on Richter's forged memo. They knew the story's weight. Klein laid out the lesson plainly: confirmation bias. The Allies had been so afraid of Hitler's escape that they accepted the evidence that confirmed it. They had wanted the deception to be true. Richter had understood that, and used it perfectly. The Argentine memo became a case study for generations of intelligence officers. It demonstrated how emotion could override reason, how fear could manipulate even the sharpest minds. Klein spoke of the small details: the mismatched ink, the typewriter inconsistencies, the forged seal. He emphasized that truth, in intelligence, was often hidden not in the big picture, but in the margins. The deception failed, he said, because someone paid attention to the spaces between the words. When the session ended, several officers approached him quietly. They didn't congratulate him. They thanked him. One of them, a young man just beginning his career, said, "Sir, you made intelligence sound like a moral responsibility." Klein nodded. "That's exactly what it is." As the audience left, Klein stood by the window overlooking the city. Washington was busy, alive with the hum of post-war optimism. But he knew optimism could be dangerous when paired with forgetfulness. He thought about the war's final months, the endless analysis, the sleepless nights, the narrow path between truth and illusion. He knew those lessons would be needed again. The world was shifting, and the lines between ally and adversary were already blurring. Later that year, he received a classified dossier containing post-war German intelligence assessments. Buried inside was a summary of psychological operations conducted during the war. Among them, an entry marked Operation Südlicher Zufluchtsort, the German title for Southern Sanctuary. It described the operation's purpose: to induce strategic hesitation in the enemy by exploiting their expectation of Hitler's survival. The report confirmed what Klein had long suspected. It hadn't been a random deception. It was an organized effort, sanctioned by high command and executed by Richter's team. The file ended with a brief note: Major Anton Richter, status confirmed deceased. Berlin, April 1945. Klein read it twice. He felt no triumph, only understanding. In an interview years later, he would say, "I never thought of him as an enemy. He was a craftsman like me. He built illusions. I dismantled them. We fought the same war in different rooms." That statement would stay with his colleagues for decades. The Argentine Memo case reshaped the foundations of post-war intelligence. The OSS, soon to become the CIA, adopted new verification standards. Every major document was now reviewed by multiple analysts from separate departments. Independent cross-checking became mandatory. Klein's report directly influenced those policies. It was his quiet legacy, a system designed to ensure that no single illusion could ever again divert entire nations. But beyond the procedures and reforms, Klein's story carried a deeper message about the nature of truth in times of conflict. Truth, he often said, was not a fixed point. It was a balance between evidence and belief. Too much faith, and you were blind. Too much doubt, and you were paralyzed. The work of intelligence was to walk that narrow line, question everything, but never surrender to cynicism. Klein continued to serve in advisory roles for several years. Yet he never spoke publicly about the operation. The files remained sealed. When asked about his wartime service, he would simply say, "I worked in analysis." But within the intelligence community, his name became a quiet legend, a reminder that victory in the unseen war depended not only on strength, but on discernment. And as the Cold War deepened, the lessons of Operation Southern Sanctuary became more relevant than ever. Nations built new weapons, new networks, new strategies, but the human mind remained the most vulnerable target. Klein understood that better than anyone. He had seen how a single sheet of paper could change the direction of armies, how fear could move faster than truth, how deception could live longer than the men who created it. He never met Richter, but sometimes, in his quiet moments, he imagined what the German major might have said if they had faced each other across a table, not as enemies, but as two men who understood the same dark art. He suspected Richter would have smiled faintly and said, "We both did our jobs," and perhaps Klein would have nodded, because in the end, that was all either of them had done: serve truth or illusion in a world that often confused the two. Decades later, when the war's secrets finally began to surface, historians found a file buried deep in Allied archives. Label: Operation Phantom Exodus. Inside, copies of the Southern Sanctuary Protocol, notes in Klein's handwriting, and fragments of German intelligence papers signed by Major Anton Richter. For years, the file had been sealed, forgotten among thousands of wartime operations. But when it was declassified, it shocked researchers. The deception had been far more sophisticated than anyone realized. It wasn't a single forged document. It was an entire network of false trails, coded messages, and planted sources. Richter's operation became known as the Ghost Protocol. Its purpose: to create a phantom escape plan so convincing that the Allies would follow it. And they did. For 4 months, the world's most powerful intelligence forces had hunted something that never existed. Historians later called it one of the most successful deceptions of the war's final year, not because it lasted long, but because it revealed how fragile truth could be. When the files opened, Klein's name appeared in brief mentions: analyst, London section, verification lead. Nothing about obsession, sleepless nights, or the private battle he fought against a lie that nearly outsmarted the Allies. But those who read the full records understood. Without Klein's persistence, the deception might have continued into the war's end. The chase for phantom submarines could have consumed vital resources. His discovery shortened confusion, saved effort, and redirected focus to Berlin at a decisive moment. The Ghost Protocol became a permanent case study in intelligence academies around the world. Trainees learned how Klein had spotted the smallest flaw, a mismatched date, a dead officer's name, and how that single inconsistency unraveled an entire illusion. They also studied Richter's brilliance, his understanding of human fear, his precision in crafting believable lies. The lesson was simple but profound. Never trust what you most want to believe. The operation's legacy extended beyond history books. Intelligence agencies worldwide reformed their methods. Every critical document now required multiple verifications. Independent analysts reviewed data from separate channels. Systems were built to prevent one mind's bias from steering national strategy. Richter's deception had forced the world to become smarter. In later years, journalists occasionally asked Klein about the Argentine case. He always declined interviews. In the few public lectures he gave, he spoke only in general terms about vigilance, evidence, and the need for humility in intelligence work. When pressed about Richter, he said, "He taught me that truth and lies are closer than most people realize. Sometimes they share the same handwriting." When Klein passed away in 1983, his obituary was brief. It mentioned his wartime service and post-war advisory role, but not the operation that defined his life. Only those within the intelligence community truly understood the scale of what he had done. As for Richter, his name faded into history. Some German archives listed him as missing in action. Others confirmed his death in late April 1945. No photograph survived. Only his work did, buried for decades, then rediscovered as a lesson for future generations. In the end, their invisible duel shaped the future of intelligence far more than either man could have imagined. Richter had created a deception to protect his crumbling nation. Klein had dismantled it to protect the truth. Both succeeded, in their own ways. The Ghost Protocol remains their shared legacy, a story of how two minds, locked in silent opposition, changed the unseen course of a world at war.